Imagine this, you're one of Hitler's elite soldiers. It's 1941, and you're marching towards the Soviet Union, confident in victory. Your officers tell you the war will be over in a few months. The mighty German war machine has crushed every enemy before this. What could possibly go wrong? But then winter arrives, and suddenly everything changes. Your gun freezes, your rations run out, and the enemy, they know how to fight in this brutal cold. The dream of conquest quickly turns into a nightmare of survival. This is the story of Hitler's biggest mistake, attacking Russia in winter. A mistake so catastrophic that it changed the course of World War II forever. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. Over 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and thousands of tanks stormed into Soviet territory. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would fall within a few months. After all, the German blitzkrieg had already crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe in record time. The Soviets, Hitler believed, would be no different. But there was one major problem. Hitler underestimated both the Soviet Union and the Russian winter. At first, it seemed like Hitler was right. The German army advanced at lightning speed. Cities fell, Soviet divisions were encircled, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. The world watched in awe as Germany seemed unstoppable. Even Stalin himself was in shock. By September, the Germans had captured Kiev, Smolensk, and were marching towards Moscow. But then Hitler made a critical mistake. Instead of pushing directly towards Moscow, he diverted his forces to Leningrad and Ukraine, delaying the main attack on the Soviet capital. This decision gave the Red Army valuable time to regroup and prepare for what was coming next. Then, in October 1941, the nightmare began. The Russian winter arrived earlier than expected, and with it temperatures plunged to 41 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees. German soldiers, still dressed in their summer uniforms, began to freeze. Their weapons jammed, tanks broke down, and supply lines stretched too thin to keep up with the harsh conditions. The blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and mobility, ground to a halt in the deep snow. On the other hand, the Soviets were prepared. They had winter clothing, their T-34 tanks were designed for cold weather, and their soldiers were trained for winter warfare. The tables were turning. The Battle of Moscow, Germany's first major defeat. In December 1941, Hitler launched his final push towards Moscow, but the Soviets had fortified the city with over 1.5 million troops. Just when the Germans were at their weakest, Stalin ordered a massive counterattack. Led by General Georgy Zhukov, Soviet forces pushed the Germans back hundreds of kilometers. It was the first major defeat for Hitler in World War II. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Hitler, however, refused to accept defeat. In 1942, he launched another invasion deep into Soviet territory, focusing on capturing Stalingrad. This battle became one of the bloodiest in history, lasting over 5 months. The city was reduced to rubble, and fighting took place street by street, house by house. But the Soviet resistance was unbreakable. In February 1943, after months of brutal combat, the German Sixth Army was completely surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 850,000 German soldiers were lost. This was the turning point of the war. From this moment on, Germany was on the defensive, and the Soviet Union began its push towards Berlin. The consequences of Hitler's mistake. Germany's army was severely weakened. After the disasters of Moscow and Stalingrad, the once feared Nazi war machine was never the same. The Soviets gained momentum. The Red Army launched massive offensives, eventually pushing all the way to Berlin. Hitler lost credibility. His military decisions became more erratic, and even his top generals began doubting his leadership. Germany now had to fight a two-front war. With the United States entering the war in December 1941, Hitler was now fighting both the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. This stretched German resources to the breaking point. The final blow. The fall of Berlin. By April 1945, the Soviet army had reached Berlin. The city was in ruins, German forces were outnumbered, and Hitler was trapped in his bunker. The same dictator who had once dreamed of conquering the world was now facing his inevitable end. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life, and 1 week later Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Conclusion. Lessons from history. So what can we learn from this? Overconfidence can be deadly. Hitler believed he was invincible, but he underestimated both the enemy and the environment. History has shown that even the most powerful forces can crumble if they make the wrong decisions. If Hitler had studied Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia in 1812, he might have realised that winter is an enemy of its own, but instead he repeated history's mistake and paid the price. One decision can change the course of history, and Hitler's decision to attack Russia in winter sealed his fate.